In recent weeks, the struggle for influence in the Middle East has entered a new chapter. Information and analysis point to an increasingly solid alignment between China and Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, especially in strategic areas such as defense, technology, and intelligence. This movement occurs while the United States' military presence remains active in the region, creating a scenario where three major powers, Washington, Tehran, and Beijing, observe and adjust to each other in real time. Simultaneously, the recent silence surrounding Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has fueled rumors and speculation about internal stability in Tehran, adding another layer of political uncertainty. In this video, we will contextualize these elements, explain what is at stake and why the issue matters now for U.S. foreign policy and the global strategic balance. If you value serious and straightforward analysis of what's really happening in the world, please like and subscribe to the channel. This greatly strengthens the channel and helps me bring content that doesn't usually appear in traditional media. Also, let us know where you're watching from. Now let's understand this whole situation. Understanding the role of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps within Iran requires a brief look back at the period following the Iranian Revolution, when the country underwent a profound change in its state structure. After the fall of the monarchy, the new political leaders realized that it was not enough to maintain the traditional armed forces, as they were formed under the old government, and, in the revolutionaries' view, might not offer guarantees of loyalty to the new regime. From this realization, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was born, conceived from the outset with a dual mission: to protect the new political system from within, and to expand Iran's ideological and strategic influence outwards. Unlike conventional armed forces, which follow a state logic of defense against external threats within international parameters, the Guard answers directly to the highest authority in the country and possesses considerable autonomy. This created an unusual structure, a state with two distinct military apparatuses, each with different objectives and methods of operation. The Guard is organized with its own land, air, and naval units, conducts ideological training for its members, and has developed over the decades the capacity to operate in various domains, including cyber warfare, a field where states seek to gather intelligence, influence narratives, and protect themselves from digital attacks. Another aspect that distinguishes the Guard is its use of allied external actors to expand Iranian reach in the region. These groups, often called proxies, function as indirect arms that share Iran's strategic objectives, without the Guard needing to openly engage in conventional military operations. This model offers the country a kind of strategic buffer, allowing Tehran to influence conflicts, negotiate positions, and pressure adversaries without triggering immediate international responses. Internally, the presence of this Guard shapes politics, the economy, and even industrial sectors, reinforcing the central role it occupies within the Iranian structure. Thus, Iran has become a regional power with hybrid capabilities, combining military force, ideological influence, indirect relations, and intelligence. When we observe this scenario from Washington's point of view, we understand why the United States has maintained a constant interest in the Middle East region for so many decades. The American presence cannot be treated in isolation, as it is the result of energy, economic, military, and diplomatic factors that became even clearer after the end of World War II and during the Cold War. The Middle East concentrates some of the largest oil and gas reserves on the planet and, more importantly, controls crucial maritime routes for the global economy. Among these routes is the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow corridor that connects the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea, and through which a large percentage of the oil exported to various international markets circulates. The stability of this passage is directly important for world trade and, consequently, for the economic interests of the United States and its allies. Over the decades, Washington has also developed strategic alliances with countries in the region that share security interests, such as the Gulf monarchies and Israel. These alliances serve to ensure a balance of power and prevent a single state from militarily dominating the region or threatening the flow of oil and gas. Furthermore, since the end of the last century, the Iranian nuclear program has become a sensitive issue for the United States. Washington sees Tehran as a challenge to its interests and its allies, and this perception has led to episodes of tension that have included economic sanctions, diplomatic negotiations, naval incidents, and indirect attacks carried out by actors aligned with Iran. This is why, when discussing the Middle East, The United States rarely treats the issue merely as a local problem, but rather as part of a broader equation involving energy, defense, maritime routes, alliances, and international credibility. If these elements become unbalanced, it has impacts on fuel prices, financial markets, and political debates within the United States itself. If this explanation makes sense and helps you see the bigger picture, comment with the word context, so I know you're following along and enjoying the content. Against this backdrop, it becomes easier to understand why the partnership between China and Iran has garnered so much attention in recent years. China, which until the end of the last century maintained a more cautious stance in the Middle East, has today become a power with global commercial and energy ambitions. The Chinese economy demands enormous amounts of energy, and Iran, despite sanctions, possesses large reserves of oil and gas. This structural complementarity has led the two countries to develop lasting energy cooperation. Beyond the energy aspect, China has become an important alternative for Iran in international trade, especially after sanctions imposed by the United States and the European Union. Western companies and banks have reduced their activities with Tehran, while China has offered new channels for transactions, investments, and long-term agreements. Another important factor is the diplomatic aspect. Both Iran and China seek, in different ways, to reduce their dependence on financial and diplomatic mechanisms dominated by the West. For Iran, this means surviving and maintaining strategic autonomy even under economic pressure. For China, it means expanding its presence in regions where the United States has historically exerted great influence. This partnership alters the regional geopolitical balance because it gives Iran an alternative to Western pressures and creates a more solid entry point for China into the Middle East. Technological cooperation is also a relevant component. It involves civilian and military areas, such as communication infrastructure, surveillance technologies, and potential industrial transfers. The result is an indirect strengthening of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which gains access to resources and technologies less conditioned by Western diplomacy. Furthermore, the partnership reinforces the Chinese project of integrating commercial centers and energy routes within the initiative known as the Belt and Road Initiative, which connects Asia, Europe, and Africa. The sum of these movements has provoked increased international attention, especially because in recent months there have been signs of a possible escalation between Iran and the United States. These perceptions arise when naval forces conduct exercises in sensitive areas, when military spokespeople make firm statements, or when leaders undertake unexpected diplomatic trips. Part of these actions is related to maintaining an American military presence in the Gulf, which includes ships, aircraft, and cooperation with allied countries. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, in turn, also conducts patrols, equipment tests, and communiques on the defense of sovereignty. These dynamics, when occurring simultaneously, create an environment where analysts, journalists, and digital platforms begin to debate the possibility of direct confrontations. However, it is necessary to understand that signs of escalation do not always translate into armed conflict. The Middle East is historically marked by cycles of tension and accommodation. Many of these actions serve a deterrent function, meaning demonstrating strength to prevent the other side from taking hostile measures. Despite this, the current digital environment amplifies interpretations of all kinds. Alternative media and independent channels dedicate themselves to analyzing every move, every statement, and every rumor, generating analyses ranging from diplomatic projections to war scenarios. For those researching geopolitics, this material can be useful, provided it is filtered with caution. What really matters is that the possibility of instability in the region worries energy markets, European governments, and the American establishment itself, as any interruption in the flow of oil through the Gulf could impact global prices, inflation, and international logistics. Furthermore, the perception that China is supporting Iran, even indirectly, connects to the biggest debate of the current century: the strategic competition between Washington and Beijing for global influence. If you're following along and notice how all these movements connect and affect international politics, comment with the word analysis below, because it helps me know that you value this type of content and support the channel. Within Iran's political structure, there is an authority that holds singular weight in the functioning of the state and in guiding the country on military, diplomatic, and ideological issues. This authority is the supreme leader, a figure created after the Iranian Revolution with the aim of concentrating strategic decisions and ensuring that the new system does not deviate from the principles that underpinned the overthrow of the monarchy. Unlike elected heads of government, who change according to electoral cycles, the supreme leader remains in office for life and has influence over the armed forces, the judiciary, and various political institutions. For this reason, his public presence has both symbolic and operational value. When he participates in speeches, meetings, or ceremonies, he sends signals both inside and outside the country. This role means that prolonged absences attract attention, especially in a highly sensitive environment like the Middle East. When the supreme leader reduces his appearances, whether due to health issues or internal decisions, it generates rumors that circulate both within the country and in international analysis networks. This reaction occurs because many observers associate prolonged silence with possible power transitions or internal disputes, since the succession of the supreme leader involves complex negotiations within the Iranian establishment. Although many of these rumors never materialize, they affect external perception, leading some analysts to interpret these episodes as signs of fragility or uncertainty. In reality, the mere debate about succession already produces political consequences. As internal actors adjust their positions, influential groups seek to secure space, and the domestic scene becomes more attentive to any institutional change. This sensitivity helps explain why the international community reacts quickly to information related to the supreme leader. His role is central to the functioning of the regime, and his absence, even if temporary, modifies expectations and discourses about the country's future. If this context makes sense and helps you understand how Iranian leadership influences politics and geopolitics, please comment with the word leadership in the comments so I know you're following along closely. Understanding Iranian leadership cannot be separated from the country's domestic landscape, which has experienced significant periods of social tension in recent decades. Iran is a large, populous, and ethnically diverse country, with a youth connected to the digital world, living under a closed political system and facing economic difficulties stemming from international sanctions, inflation, and industrial limitations. Over the past few years, protests have occurred in different regions of the country, motivated by economic, social, or cultural issues. These episodes have been closely observed by foreign analysts because they reveal internal dynamics that often do not appear in official discourse. When protests occur, the Iranian state responds through its security institutions, including the police, and in more sensitive episodes, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. This guard is not only a military instrument, but also a political and social actor, and its actions in protests signal that the regime is treating the episode as a matter of national security. For the population, these moments produce immediate social effects including commotion, intergenerational debates, and discussions about the role of the state. From an international perspective, internal protests are of interest because they demonstrate that, in addition to external rivalries, the country is grappling with domestic demands that can influence its diplomatic stance. Internal instability can, for example, increase the regime's caution in engaging in external tensions, or conversely, it can encourage it to use foreign policy to reinforce its internal legitimacy, a phenomenon that political scientists call diversionary politics, where governments broaden their focus on external threats to strengthen domestic unity. In the case of Iran, there are also diaspora communities abroad that operate on social media, the international press, and civil organizations to disseminate information, pressure governments, and draw attention to internal protests. This interaction between domestic society and the external diaspora broadens the reach of the protests and reinforces the impact of these episodes on global perception. Therefore, when observing Iranian protests, the world is not merely witnessing isolated domestic tensions, but rather a reflection of how internal and external pressures intertwine in a country that occupies a sensitive point on the global map. Iran does not exist in an international vacuum, and much of its internal and external dynamics are influenced by decades of sanctions and diplomatic isolation. Sanctions are instruments used by countries or multilateral organizations to pressure governments to change certain behaviors. In the case of Iran, sanctions have gone through several phases since the end of the last century. Initially, they were applied in response to specific events and restricted to certain sectors. Over time, especially after disputes related to the Iranian nuclear program. Sanctions became broader and began to affect banks, companies, oil exports, technology, and access to the global financial system. The practical effect was to limit Iran's ability to conduct international transactions, attract investment, and modernize infrastructure. This isolation accelerated self-sufficiency in some sectors, such as the military and energy industries, but created significant difficulties in areas that depend on technological exchange, such as civil aviation, medicine, and the electronics industry. Even under pressure, Iran found partners willing to maintain trade relations, and among these partners, China occupies a central place. Beijing not only continued buying Iranian oil, but also expanded infrastructure investments and maintained stable diplomatic ties. Besides China, countries like Russia, Syria, and Venezuela maintain strategic relations with Tehran, creating an alternative network that partially compensates for its isolation from the West. This adaptability explains why the sanctions did not produce an immediate political collapse, but rather modified how Iran negotiates with the world. For Washington and its European allies, the sanctions serve as a way to pressure behavior and contain projects considered problematic. For Tehran, they reinforce the narrative of resistance and encourage the search for alliances outside the Western sphere. This complex geopolitical game shows how diplomacy, economics, and security are interconnected in the Iranian case. If you understand how sanctions and alternative alliances change the international balance, comment with the word sanctions in the comments because it shows that you are absorbing this analysis. The combination of centralized leadership, internal tensions, and diplomatic isolation creates repercussions that extend beyond Iran and impact other countries. When analysts discuss scenarios of escalation between Iran and the United States, they are not only assessing possible military confrontations, but also considering the entire architecture of global security and trade. If there is instability in the Gulf, strategic maritime routes could be affected, especially in the Strait of Hormuz, which is fundamental for the circulation of oil and gas. A disruption in this area could raise energy prices, impact inflation, and alter geopolitical calculations in Europe and Asia, regions dependent on imports. Furthermore, tensions involving Iran generally provoke action from other powers. Russia, for example, maintains defense ties with Tehran and could use this relationship as a diplomatic tool in negotiations with the West. China, in turn, observes the scenario closely because it depends on the free flow of oil from the Gulf for its own economy. European countries fear that instability in the region could result in energy crises, uncontrolled migrations, or diplomatic ruptures requiring a coordinated response from the European Union. The presence of the United States as a military and diplomatic actor in the region is seen by allies as a stabilizing factor, and by adversaries as a challenge to regional autonomy. This dispute over narratives and positions shows that the Iran-United States-China case is not merely a bilateral or regional issue, but rather an element within the global competition that is shaping the current century. When experts try to project what might happen in the short and medium term, they generally work with three broad types of scenarios that don't express opinions, but help organize thinking. In the first scenario, the current situation remains the same. This means continuity of the Iranian regime, American military presence in the Gulf, strategic partnership between Iran and China, and absence of direct conflict. This scenario preserves the status quo and keeps the diplomatic and economic game within known patterns. In a second scenario, there is an intensification of economic and diplomatic pressure. This could occur if sanctions are expanded, if agreements are canceled, or if there is a change in the West's stance on regional events. This scenario would generate internal difficulties for Iran and expand the role of countries like China and Russia as alternative partners. In a third scenario, there is localized military escalation. This does not mean full-blown war between major powers, but rather limited episodes involving indirect attacks, naval incidents, or clashes between allied groups. This type of escalation can arise from miscalculations, misinterpretations, or actions by non-state actors operating in the region. In all these scenarios, there are risks to the international order, whether in the energy field, diplomacy, or security. This is why the Iran-United States-China case has become one of the cornerstones of contemporary geopolitics, as it brings together energy, Diplomacy, militarization, technology, and competition between great powers within the same analytical framework. The situation in the Middle East continues to evolve, and every new sign is important for understanding how the dispute between the United States, Iran, and their allies could redefine trade routes, military strategies, and regional balances. If this overview provided clarity, please like, subscribe to the channel, and if you watched until the end, comment, "I'm paying attention." Get ready. The next video is already on screen and brings an urgent warning about desertions in the Revolutionary Guard and the approach of American forces.